I remember the rain hitting the window that night, soft at first, then insistent, tapping against the glass in a rhythm that felt almost alive. And when I think back to that moment, I realize that I remember the rain more clearly than the words that followed, because the words were a shock, and the shock is something that doesn't leave you. It burrows under your skin, and if you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to all of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm a mother, a daughter, a granddaughter, and I tell you this story not because it's dramatic, but because it's real, and because silence is something that hurts more than words ever could. My father, Daniel Harper, was alone that night in his Vancouver apartment, a small space that smelled faintly of coffee, old books, and the lemon cleaner he used every Sunday. A man retired early, quiet, meticulous, and kind. A man who lived simply and yet carried the weight of everyone else's needs on his shoulders, and he answered the tablet call like he did every Tuesday night, ready to see his granddaughter, Lily, 7 years old, her hair in messy braids, the gap in her front teeth giving her a perpetually surprised expression, holding up a drawing she'd made in school, snowflakes with spidery lines that made you marvel at the patience of a 7-year-old mind. And for the first few minutes, everything was ordinary, warm, comforting, the kind of call that erases distance if only for a moment. But then, just as he smiled, just as he leaned in to praise her art, her voice shifted, just slightly, the way a child's voice shifts when they're afraid they might be overstepping a boundary, and she asked, "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" And before he could respond, she said the words that froze him. "Is it normal for grown-ups to take pictures of kids without clothes?" And the sound of the rain seemed louder, the walls of his apartment smaller, the warm glow of the lamp casting shadows he would remember for years. And before he could answer, the screen flickered. His mother, Margaret Harper, my child's grandmother, reached into the frame with a sharpness that made her look entirely different from the woman he thought he knew, and the call ended abruptly, blackness replacing the screen, silence replacing the words, and when he tried to call back, there was only voicemail, missed calls stacking on top of each other like bricks in a wall he could not scale, and he left messages, his voice growing more urgent with every attempt, every ring unanswered, every silence stretching further until it became almost unbearable, and that night he barely slept, replaying her question over and over, wondering if he'd misheard, wondering if he was overreacting, because when you're an older man living alone, 3,000 miles from your family, the world has a way of telling you that your instincts are outdated, that you're seeing danger where there is none, and yet something deep inside him told him this was real, that something was wrong, and that he had no choice but to act, even if action seemed impossible. Before I go any further, I need you to understand our family, because nothing that happened makes sense without knowing the fractures that existed long before that call. My daughter, Lily, was the heart of my world, gentle, creative, trusting, loving art, snowflakes, and stories about imaginary kingdoms that made bedtime magical, and yet the adults around her, the people she should have been able to trust without hesitation, were not always as they seemed. Her father, Mark Reynolds, my ex-husband, was distant most of the time, tied up in his job in Seattle, and the divorce had left me with a sense of constant juggling, trying to maintain her routine, my career, and a semblance of normalcy. And for a time, my parents, Daniel and Margaret, seemed like an anchor, the people I could rely on to provide safety, guidance, and love in equal measure. And I trusted them because I had to, because parenting alone doesn't leave you the luxury of doubt, and because Margaret had always been careful to position herself as indispensable, always ready with a warm smile, always insisting she knew what was best for Lily, and for years, that strategy worked. My father had always been quiet, attentive, careful, never dramatic, the kind of man who fixed things without fanfare, who listened instead of judging, who noticed the subtle shifts in a child's behavior without needing to be told, and that attentiveness made him perfect for noticing what most adults would have missed. I wish I could say we all saw the signs earlier, that we all acted, that we all knew the danger, but hindsight is a cruel teacher, and we didn't see it, not fully, not until it was too late. After the call ended that night, my father's attempts to reach me were fruitless, and when I finally listened to his messages, his voice was trembling in a way I had never heard before, the urgency and fear palpable, and I realized immediately that this was not a misunderstanding, that something was wrong, and I felt a tightening in my chest, a fear I had tried to ignore for years. The knowledge that children rarely invent questions like that without reason, and that if my father's instincts were correct, the person we all trusted to protect Lily might actually be the source of harm. I confronted my mother cautiously, carefully, wanting desperately to believe her version, that Lily had misunderstood something from school, that my father had misinterpreted innocent curiosity, and she laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that masked something darker, and said exactly that it was nothing, that he was overreacting, that age and distance had dulled his perception. And that was the first real moment of betrayal, the first time I realized that someone I had loved and trusted was willing to gaslight a 7-year-old's voice to protect herself, and in that moment I knew that what had started as a question was about to become a battle, a long, grueling, emotional war, the kind you never imagine in the middle of a normal Tuesday evening, but one that changes the shape of your family forever. Over the next weeks, my father tried everything he could from Vancouver, calling lawyers, reaching out to social services, trying to make someone listen, trying to find a way to bridge the impossible gap of geography and legality, and every time he was told no, that without direct evidence, without being physically present, there was nothing he could do, that he might even make matters worse, and with each rejection, his frustration grew, his panic mounting, until he began questioning himself, wondering if he was imagining things, wondering if he was the villain in his own story, and during that same time, I struggled with disbelief and denial, because accepting the truth meant accepting that my mother was capable of betraying my trust in the most unimaginable way, and the emotional weight of that truth is something that settles over you like fog, obscuring everything else, but refusing to lift until you act. Then, as if by chance, something emerged, something Margaret hadn't thought to delete, a forgotten folder on an old shared cloud account, images that confirmed the fears my father had expressed all along, not in explicit detail, but enough to remove doubt, enough to prove that Lily's question had been legitimate, that the danger had existed, and that her trust in the adults around her had been misplaced, and in that moment, my father knew he could no longer stay silent, could no longer hope that denial would protect anyone, and he called me immediately, the fear in his voice now anchored by certainty, and we began what would become a long, painful process of intervention, confrontation, and legal action, the kind of work that leaves scars on everyone involved. And the more we learned, the more complex it became, the more we realized that justice is not linear, that the system is designed to protect appearances rather than truth, and that sometimes the right choice comes at a tremendous cost. I remember the hours spent on phone calls, the long, weary conversations with lawyers who tried to navigate the impossibility of cross-border laws, the way my father meticulously documented every call, every voicemail, every missed opportunity to intervene, and how we began piecing together a picture that was horrifying in its implications, terrifying in its clarity, and yet, it was the truth, and the truth demanded action, and I had to find the courage to do something I had been avoiding for months, which was to face my mother, to confront the person who had been my anchor, my mother, the person I had believed would never betray a child, and when we did, her reaction was immediate, defensive, calculating, anger barely restrained, and suddenly the woman I had trusted my whole life became a stranger hiding behind the familiar, and that confrontation, painful as it was, set the stage for the next steps, which involved authorities, investigators, social workers, and most importantly, the safety of my daughter, which had to come before everything else, including my own comfort, including family loyalty, including the desperate wish that none of this were true. And so began the months of assessments, interviews, restricted visitation, legal wrangling, the kind of slow-moving, grinding process that seems interminable when you are living it but necessary when the stakes are a child's life. And through it all, Lily had to navigate her own confusion, her own fear, her own sense that something she had trusted her whole life was not what it seemed. And I had to be the anchor she needed while also managing the heartbreak of confronting my own mother, the betrayal that cut deeper than anything I could have imagined, the realization that people we love are capable of harm when unchecked power meets secrecy. There were moments of hope, brief flashes where Lily smiled, where she drew snowflakes again, where her laughter was not forced but genuine, moments that reminded us why the struggle was worth it, why we endured the endless calls, the paperwork, the court dates, the slow, agonizing unraveling of a family, and even then, the resolution was partial, never clean, never complete, because consequences are messy, because justice is never perfect, because even when the truth comes to light, it does not erase what happened. It does not undo the damage. It only marks the path forward, a path that must be walked carefully, with vigilance, with love, with an awareness that silence is always the easier option, but it is also the deadlier one. Today, Lily is safe. She is healing. She is growing into a thoughtful, cautious, and resilient young girl, and though the scars remain, visible and invisible, she knows that her voice matters, that when she speaks, adults will listen, and that knowledge is a fragile but powerful shield, one we are committed to maintaining. And when I tell you this story, I tell it not to shock you, but to remind you that danger often hides behind familiar faces, that the questions children ask are rarely frivolous, and that the courage to act when you are afraid is the only thing that can prevent tragedy. And if you have listened this far, if this story has held your attention, if it has made your heart race or ache or tighten with recognition, then you are already part of breaking the silence. And that matters more than you know, because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what a child says, it's what adults choose not to hear. And every choice we make has consequences that ripple far beyond what we can see. After the initial shock, after the folders had been uncovered, after the first calls to authorities that felt like shouting into an empty void, the real weight of what had happened began to settle on all of us, a slow, heavy pressure that made every decision feel urgent yet impossible, and yet we had no choice but to move forward, because Lily's safety demanded action, and even when action felt futile, it was all we had. My father, Daniel, spent hours meticulously documenting everything, from the date and time of the call to every word Lily had spoken, his hand cramping from endless note-taking, his tablet filling with screenshots, messages, and backup files, a digital trail meant to prove the unimaginable. And even as he worked, I could hear the exhaustion in his voice over the phone, the way he sighed and muttered to himself, the way he replayed the call in his head, over and over, the way he tried to imagine alternative explanations and failed every single time, because the truth does not bend for convenience. I remember sitting on my bed in Seattle that night, phone pressed to my ear, listening to him recount every detail as if repeating it would somehow make it less terrible, and realizing that the battle we were entering was not just about evidence or proof. It was about the sheer endurance of conscience, the courage to speak when everyone around you says silence is safer. Margaret, my mother, remained outwardly calm during those days, her composure masking the storm, but in private moments, through cracks in the veneer, you could see her irritation at being questioned, her frustration that the carefully constructed life she had built around control and influence was now under scrutiny, and in those moments, I realized something that both terrified and galvanized me. People who hide harm are dangerous not because they are overtly violent, but because they are clever, meticulous, and utterly convinced of their own righteousness, and convincing the world that something is real when everyone else wants to believe comfortingly in innocence is an exhausting, almost impossible task. I called social workers repeatedly, leaving messages that grew more urgent with each day, and at first, I was met with the usual responses. Without direct observation, without a disclosure from Lily herself, there was little they could do. Jurisdictional issues complicated intervention, and until tangible proof could be presented, their hands were tied, and that frustration, the bureaucratic wall between fear and action, was almost suffocating, but Daniel reminded me every day that we couldn't give up, that persistence itself was a form of protection, that every phone call, every document, every carefully logged detail was a lifeline for Lily, and as days turned into weeks, we began to see the first glimmers of progress, small victories that were both encouraging and terrifying in their fragility. I visited Lily when the authorities allowed, and each visit was emotionally exhausting, a mixture of relief, fear, and heartbreak, because while I could see her smile, see the spark of her curiosity return in small ways, there were moments where her gaze would flicker, wary, cautious, a tiny shadow passing over her young features, and I realized that even though she was physically safe, the betrayal she had experienced was not something that could be erased overnight. We began therapy sessions, both for her and for the family, to help her articulate feelings she didn't yet have words for, to help me navigate the complicated emotions of confronting a parent who had violated trust, and to help Daniel process the helplessness he had felt, the guilt of distance, the torment of knowing something was wrong and not being able to intervene directly. The sessions were grueling, but necessary, peeling back layers of fear and confusion that had been silently accumulating for years. One afternoon, after weeks of legal maneuvering and painstaking coordination with lawyers, investigators, and child advocates, Daniel uncovered something even more unexpected, a small device that had been misplaced, a phone tucked away in a drawer that contained recordings and images, subtle, disturbing, enough to reaffirm the gravity of the situation, and the discovery shifted the entire trajectory of the case. It was no longer just a matter of suspicion. There was undeniable proof that required authorities to act decisively, and while the legal wheels turned slowly, the knowledge that the danger had been real was both horrifying and relieving, because at least now, in some small measure, the adults who could intervene would have the information they needed. Margaret's reaction to this discovery was immediate, sharp, defensive, anger flashing in her eyes, her calm exterior finally cracking under the weight of exposure. And in that moment, the reality of her betrayal hit me with full force, because the person I had trusted implicitly, the person I had relied on for guidance, had actively manipulated, controlled, and endangered a child. And there was no forgiveness for such actions, only consequences, and those consequences were beginning to unfold. Court dates followed, each more draining than the last, each involving careful presentations of evidence, depositions, and interviews that required Lily to navigate spaces filled with strangers asking questions she didn't fully understand, and my heart broke each time I saw the strain on her face, the way her small hands clenched into fists when she felt overwhelmed, the way she would retreat into drawing as a way to reclaim control. And yet each session was necessary, a step toward accountability, toward safety, toward the establishment of boundaries that had been so violently disregarded in the past. Daniel and I coordinated tirelessly, our lives consumed by calls, documents, meetings, and constant strategizing, and every day brought new challenges. Lawyers questioning motives, authorities probing for inconsistencies, and Margaret's subtle manipulation to sway opinion, to cast doubt, to frame concern as paranoia, and through it all, Daniel's steady presence, his unwavering insistence on truth, became a source of strength, a reminder that courage is not always loud, that persistence and attention to detail can save a child's life, even when the odds seem impossible. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining all the ways things could go wrong, all the ways a legal system designed for neutrality could fail a child in danger, and yet I also imagined Lily safe, her laughter returning, her curiosity intact, and those images were the fuel that kept me moving, kept me fighting, kept me speaking when silence would have been easier. Flashbacks haunted me during those nights, memories of Lily asking innocent questions, of moments where I had dismissed warnings as trivial, of times when my own trust in Margaret had blinded me to signs that were always there, subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once you knew where to look, and I realized that part of my responsibility was not just to protect Lily now, but to reconcile my own past inattention, to acknowledge the mistakes, and to use them as motivation to prevent future harm. As weeks stretched into months, the investigation gained momentum. Authorities gathering testimony, reviewing digital evidence, assessing behavioral cues, and slowly, painfully, building a case that was unassailable. And while Margaret attempted to maintain her composure, her influence waned under scrutiny, the control she had wielded so carefully unraveling with each documented piece of evidence, each corroborated observation, each professional assessment confirming that the concerns we had raised were not only valid but urgent. One evening, Daniel called me, his voice low but trembling, because even after months of careful planning and documentation, nothing had prepared him for the finality of reality, for the moment when you see someone you trusted for decades revealed as capable of harm, and he said simply, "Claire, it's happening. They're finally listening." And I could feel the relief through the phone, tempered by exhaustion, by grief, by the understanding that even as justice moved forward, the emotional wounds would linger, indelible, shaping all of us forever. Court proceedings were lengthy, bureaucratic, and emotionally taxing, requiring careful coordination with child advocates, therapists, and legal counsel, and while every step forward was a victory, every step also reminded us of what had been lost: trust, innocence, and the fragile sense of security that children depend on to flourish, and we worked tirelessly to create an environment where Lily could begin to heal, where boundaries were clear, where the adults in her life could be relied upon to prioritize her welfare above all else. Throughout the process, I maintained a constant dialogue with Lily, explaining as much as a 7-year-old could understand, emphasizing that she had done nothing wrong, that asking questions was brave, and that we were fighting for her safety because she deserved protection, guidance, and love. And as I watched her grow more confident, more open, more willing to engage with the world again, I realized that resilience is not innate. It is cultivated, nurtured through courage, support, and the knowledge that even when betrayal occurs, there is hope, there is justice, and there are adults who will not remain silent. The final court ruling restricted Margaret's contact, established monitored visitation protocols, and required ongoing therapy for all parties involved, a compromise that was far from perfect but ensured Lily's immediate safety, and while the outcome did not erase the trauma, it created a framework for recovery, accountability, and vigilance, and Daniel and I breathed a quiet, exhausted sigh of relief knowing that at least now, in some measure, we had done the right thing, even if the scars remained. In the aftermath, our family began to rebuild slowly, cautiously, learning to navigate relationships that had been fractured, reassessing trust, and embracing the responsibility of vigilance, recognizing that safety is not a guarantee but a commitment, a daily act of presence, attention, and courage, and in this, we found small victories. Laughter returned to Lily's room, snowflake drawings reappeared on her desk. Her curiosity blossomed anew, and we celebrated milestones that felt monumental, precisely because they were achieved in the shadow of betrayal and near loss. Throughout it all, I reflected on the lessons learned. That danger often hides in plain sight, that silence is a weapon when misused, that vigilance is a form of love, and that courage is measured not in grand gestures, but in the daily commitment to act when you know something is wrong, even when the world tells you to step back, even when authority seems indifferent, even when personal cost is inevitable. And as I recount this story, I hope that it serves as a reminder to anyone listening. Trust your instincts, protect your children, question familiar authority, and do not allow comfort to blind you to reality, because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what a child says, it's what adults choose not to hear, and every moment of action, every word spoken, every step toward accountability can ripple across lives, creating safety where none existed, hope where despair lingered, and courage where fear threatened to dominate. And if you have listened this far, if your heart has tightened, if your mind is raced, then you are already part of breaking the silence. And that matters more than you know.